Thanks, Tim. Thanks for all your activism with SWAP. And now you're an elected official, so how do you like that? Woo! There you go. And it's nice to see friends here. I'm going to talk about why I wrote this book, 12 Ways to Save Democracy in Wisconsin. Then I'm going to talk about what's in the book a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about what I didn't write about in the book, because I stopped writing about a year and a half ago, and a lot of stuff has happened in the last year and a half, including January 6th and this full-fledged anti-democracy movement that we're facing here in Wisconsin and in this country. So I'm going to get to that. I'm going to talk about what constitutes that anti-democracy movement, how serious the threat it is, and how we can defeat it. And then I'm going to end with a 3 or 4 minute reading from the conclusion of my book about why I still have some hope despite all the grim news that's around us. And then I'll take a couple questions if you've got them. So, I came to Wisconsin about 41 years ago. I came here in part because of its great reputation as a progressive state. And lo and behold, we've lost that reputation. It went to hell in a handbasket, especially during the reign of Scott Walker, but it was going downhill before that. And so I got to thinking, what would it take to restore Wisconsin's reputation as a laboratory for democracy? Because under Walker, we were a laboratory for plutocracy, a petri dish for the Koch brothers. And some of the items that I figured I'd discuss are items we deal with all the time at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. The Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, it's been around since 1995. We track and expose the problem of big and dark money in our politics, and we advocate for a bunch of pro-democracy reforms. So one of the first chapters I knew I wanted to write about was campaign finance reform. And I'm happy to see a couple activists here from Wisconsin United to Amend, Richard and George, who've been very instrumental in passing referendums and resolutions all across the state saying, guess what, corporations aren't persons, and money actually isn't speech, and we should really amend the US Constitution to proclaim those things, and thereby overturn the Citizens United decision of 2010, which said corporations and super rich people can spend absolutely as much money as they ever wanted to spend to try to tell you, who should be your elected officials and what laws should be passed and what policies should be pursued. I mean, no one in this room has as much say or power over those crucial things in our democracy as the super rich and the corporations. So that's one of the chapters in there. And and it's not just Citizens United, it's a whole raft of US Supreme Court decisions, some that date back to the late 19th century that declared corporations as persons. And after the 2010 Citizens United decision, there were other bad decisions, like the McCutcheon decision in 2014. So I talk about all that. And then I talk about the problem of money in politics here in Wisconsin, which got a lot worse in 2015 when the Republican legislature and Scott Walker passed a law that said corporations, for the first time in 100 years here in Wisconsin, can now donate to political parties and legislative campaign committees. And it also lifted the amount of money that the rich could throw into the game. It used to be there was a $10,000 limit that rich people could throw into the pool here in Wisconsin in politics. And if you spent $10,000 for Jim Doyle to get elected or Scott Walker to get elected, you couldn't give a dime to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin or the Republican Party of Wisconsin. You were done. The McCutcheon decision said you can't have such aggregate limits. And so the Republicans said, well, we've got to rewrite the law. So they rewrote the law top to bottom. What they did was they doubled the amount that super rich people could give to their favorite candidates for governor. So now it's not $10,000, it's $20,000. And who can just pull out their wallet and checkbook and write a check for $20,000? So that's kind of ridiculous. It's also out of whack because you can't give more than like $2,800 to your favorite candidate for president. So why can you give $20,000 to your favorite candidate for governor? Is governor, 6 times more important than president of the United States? So that's kind of silly. Another horrible thing they did in that rewrite of our campaign finance law in 2015 was tear down the ceiling entirely on what rich people could give to political parties. There used to be this $10,000 limit. Now there's no limit at all. So super rich people in Wisconsin, like the woman who owns ABC Supply down in Beloit, or the E-Lines, for instance, they are writing million-dollar checks to the Republican Party. But you don't even need to live in Wisconsin to write million-dollar checks to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, has written checks for more than $1 million to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. And Marlene Ricketts, who's the wife of the governor of Nebraska and lives in Omaha, and is part owner of the Chicago Cubs, she writes million-dollar checks to the Republican Party of Wisconsin. So, look, they're drowning out the voices of regular people here in Wisconsin, and that's outrageous. So we need to have really serious campaign finance reform. We need to rewrite the law in Wisconsin, which is called Chapter 13, which is a real bankrupt law. And we got to overturn these decisions at the U.S. Supreme Court by amending the Constitution. There is this great movement across the country to do that. Wisconsin is second only to Massachusetts in the number of communities that have passed referendums or resolutions, 167, thanks to George and Richard. So that's a promising thing at the grassroots, but it's going to take a while. It's going to be a haul. Another issue that we deal with all the time in the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign that I write about in the book is gerrymandering, banning gerrymandering. This has been in the news a lot over the last year. I'm sure most of you have followed that. I mean, the maps are more rigged this time around than they were even in 2011, and they were terribly rigged by the Walker crew in 2011. For a second there, it looked like we might have slightly better maps this time around when the Wisconsin Supreme Court initially accepted the maps that Governor Evers had drawn because he played the game better than the Republicans did. The game that the Wisconsin Supreme Court had set up by saying you've got to use those rigged 2011 maps as the basis and then draw new maps with the least change necessary. And Evers did draw maps that had the least change. And the Republicans had a little bit more change. They moved more people around. And so Justice Hagedorn, the swing justice, the first time around said, all right, we said it was least change. We got to abide by our own criteria. And so we'll take the Evers maps. Well, what happened? Robin Vos, who drew the maps, Speaker of the Assembly, went crying all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and got his buddies at the U.S. Supreme Court to scold Hagedorn, to scold the Wisconsin Supreme Court, to say they didn't reason well enough in adopting these Evers maps, so they got to go back to square one. And then Hagedorn threw up his hands and basically said, we'll just take Voss's maps. Now, I was there when Voss was testifying about his maps last fall. I was at the Capitol with about 200 other activists. Maybe a couple of you were there. There were only two people who testified in favor of the maps that Voss and Devin Lemieux, the Speaker and the Majority Leader in the Senate, drew. The only two witnesses in favor of those maps were Voss and Lemieux themselves. There were 200 of us who testified against it and who were signed up against it. And Voss had a killer confession on the stand when he was testifying about the maps. First, he gave his usual BS about why Republicans win. Republicans win because they have better ideas. Republicans win because they got better candidates. Republicans win because Democrats crammed themselves into Milwaukee County and Dane County. And then he got down to the truth of the matter and he said, yes, we did use partisanship when we were drawing the maps. Well, that means that he tilted the maps in favor of Republicans all over the state. He didn't need to if it was just a function of better candidates, better ideas, or self-packing by Democrats. But he admitted that, yeah, they tried to mess with the lines on some of the districts around the state to give the Republicans a better advantage, an unfair advantage. And this is a huge issue for people across the ideological spectrum in Wisconsin. Poll after poll shows that 72% of Wisconsinites or more want to ban gerrymandering. They don't want the party that's in power on those even decade years to be able to do just what Robin Vos did, which is, use partisanship and tilt the lines on a map to give yourself an advantage. He crams as many Democrats into as few districts as possible, so the remaining districts are overwhelmingly, primarily Republican. That's how they win. And so we got to ban gerrymandering. 56 out of the 72 counties in Wisconsin have passed referendums or resolutions to ban gerrymandering, urging the legislature to ban gerrymandering. This is another very exciting grassroots movement here in Wisconsin to ban gerrymandering. But we've got a ways to go. We lost this time around. It's not an eternal loss. It's possible that we'll even be able to bring a case back to the Wisconsin Supreme Court after next April, because next April there's an election for a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, because Pat Rogensack, who used to be Chief Justice, is retiring. She's a right-winger. Right now, it's 4 conservatives and 3 liberals on the court. If Rogansack is replaced by a justice who is more liberal and progressive, then it's possible to bring new challenges and progressive challenges to the maps that have been drawn on the basis that they violate the Wisconsin state constitution, which talks about, ruling by the consent of the governed. Well, you don't have the consent of the governed if you're crammed into, a district because the person who drew the map wanted to tilt the map in the favor of his political party. So I've got some hope there, and there's good grassroots work going on by the Fair Maps Coalition that we're a part of, along with the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and a whole bunch of other good activist groups. So those were 2 obvious chapters to have in the book. And then another one was on voting rights. At the time, the legislature hadn't passed all these bills that Evers fortunately vetoed that were going to curtail our voting rights. So I wrote about how we could expand voting rights in Wisconsin with automatic voter registration or mail-in voting like they have in Oregon and about 12 other states. And it works great in those states. It could work here in Wisconsin. But it is horrifying to see what the legislature did with some of these bills to make voting more difficult over the last year and a half. Some of the bills would have made it impossible for the Wisconsin Elections Commission ever to do what it did last time around during the pandemic, which is send out absentee ballot applications to all registered voters. I think they should send out absentee ballots to all registered voters for every election, not just during a pandemic. But during a pandemic, they should have I think they should have sent all ballots out. Why not? But at least send out absentee ballot applications. The Republicans passed a bill that said that would be illegal under the old pandemic and under any pandemic that comes down the pike. You cannot send out absentee ballot applications en masse. Well, Evers vetoed that one. Here was the worst bill that the Republicans in the legislature introduced. It said that any employee of a nursing home who even tells any resident of a nursing home that election day is approaching, do you want to vote? Or are you registered to vote? Or would you need help registering to vote? Would be committing a felony. It would have been a felony for any employee at a nursing home. Not to tell people who to vote for, just to tell residents of the nursing home, guess what, election day is approaching, do you want to vote? So that's just an indication of how hostile the Republican legislature is toward our freedom to vote. And then we had this horrible decision recently by this judge in Waukesha in January, Judge Boren, who said that if you're voting by absentee ballot, the only way that vote is kosher is if you yourself physically deposit the absentee ballot in the mail. Now, what that meant was if I filled out my absentee ballot, and my wife filled out her absentee ballot at our dining room table, and I took both of those absentee ballots up the driveway and put it in the mailbox, that her ballot would be invalidated. That would have made her ballot bogus, would have been thrown out, not counted, because she didn't physically deposit the ballot into the mail. So that's a silly example of how bad that decision is. There's a worse implication of that decision that isn't on the silly side, but is on the anti-discrimination side, and that is it made it impossible for some people in Wisconsin to vote on April 5th who are severely physically disabled. I was at a press conference in the Capitol 10 days ago where a woman who's a activist in Disability Rights Wisconsin, a great activist group, she'd had a horrible horseback riding accident 20 years ago. She can't move her arms and legs. It is impossible for her, and it was impossible for her on April 5th to cast a ballot because she couldn't put the absentee ballot into the mailbox. She needed assistance, and under this ruling by this judge in Waukesha, upheld at least temporarily by the Wisconsin Supreme Court for the April 5th elections, she couldn't vote. And there were other persons with disabilities who couldn't vote, and there were people in jail who couldn't vote, who hadn't been convicted yet, hadn't been tried yet, hadn't been convicted yet, not convicted of a felony. They have the right to vote, but if you're in jail, you cannot physically put an absentee ballot into the mailbox. So there are whole groups of people here in Wisconsin who had their fundamental freedom to vote violated. I hope some of them will sue in federal court. Right now, the Wisconsin Supreme Court is hearing the merits of this case and will decide in the next couple of weeks about absentee ballots and about the delivery of absentee ballots, whether you can get assistance in the delivery of those ballots, and also on drop boxes. So we don't have a great Wisconsin Supreme Court. We'll see how that ruling comes out, but voting rights was an important thing. And another issue that I talk about in the book is related to voting rights for people behind bars, because, you know, in 2 states, even if you're behind bars in a prison for committing a felony, in 2 states right now in this country, you can vote. And I think actually you should be able to vote anyway, unless you are committing a crime against voting, unless you're committing voting fraud or something and you're likely to do it again. But if you committed a crime and you're sitting behind bars, a felony, in a lot of advanced industrial countries, you can vote. If you're in Maine or Vermont, you can vote if you are behind bars, having committed a felony. In Wisconsin, you can't even vote if you're outside the prison bars after you've done your time for committing a felony, if you're still on paper, as it's called, if you're still on probation, parole, or extended supervision. And that extended supervision can last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I talked to a person who used to be incarcerated who can't vote for more than 15 years because he's on paper for more than 15 years. They did their time for the crime that they were convicted of. They're outside, they're living in the community, they're trying to be good citizens, and still they can't vote. That's wrong. A lot of states in this country have given the right to former felons to vote, given that back to them, and they should get that right back. So those were a couple of the chapters in there. And then toward the end, I have 3 bigger chapters with national dimensions, kind of like the gerrymandering and money in politics having national dimensions. One is media. We have a crisis of media in this country. We have a crisis of the media in this state of Wisconsin. I travel all over the state, and there are some cities, there are some counties even, that are newspaper deserts. There's no local newspaper in the entire county. And so it's impossible for citizens really to get a clear understanding about what's happening locally at the town, at the village, at the city, at the county level. And for those who have inordinate influence because of their power or their money, or they're a big corporation from out of state, they can come in and try to throw their weight around. You saw this in the sand fracking in western Wisconsin over the last 10 years. You know, the local citizens don't know what's going on in their community. They have no way to respond. They have no way of holding people accountable. And that's not how democracy is supposed to function. So that's a real crisis, the crisis of the media. And then we have the 2 biggest problems that have faced this country from the very beginning. And the first is racism. We got to do something. We got to get rid of the racism that is ruining our country, and has ruined our country from birth, or scarred our country from birth anyway. And in writing the book, I did a little bit of research at the Wisconsin Historical Society archives about racism at the founding of the state of Wisconsin. So I went to the State Historical Society records at the State Constitutional Convention, and there was some pretty hideous racist stuff uttered at the state convention about whether black men, because black women weren't allowed to vote for another 71 years, whether black men could vote. And so I describe some of that hideousness in that chapter. And I give some ways that we can try to rectify some of the racism here in this state. Of course, it's a national problem and it's a cultural problem. And then the other big issue is economic inequality. 100 years ago, 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt said, we can't have a political democracy in this country unless we have something approaching economic democracy. And we're not approaching economic democracy in this country. We haven't been approaching economic democracy for about 40 years. We're going in the opposite direction. And that is a huge crisis that we face. So these are some of the problems I talk about. There are a bunch of other ones. I don't want to just list them 1 through 12 and give you a reason to buy the book too anyway, if you want to see what the other ones are. But I do want to talk about this anti-democracy movement that we're facing in this country, because I am more worried about the fate of our democracy today than I have been ever in my adult lifetime, and I'm going to be 64 soon. This is the scariest time for our country since there were 20,000 Nazi sympathizers gathered in Madison Square Garden in 1939 under huge red and black swastika flags. That's how dangerous it is out there. And what we saw on January 6th was that the whole system of checks and balances that we're told since, 7th grade civics class, high school social studies class, history class in college, it's such a great system of checks and balances we have in this country. Guess what? It's not so great. The whole thing almost came tumbling down on January 6th. We came that close to losing our democracy that day, and we'll hear more and more about that at these hearings that are starting right up. But look, we shouldn't underestimate that threat. I mean, for a second there on the evening of January 6th, they thought, you know what, maybe the Trump fever will break now. Maybe people will come to their senses, realize how close to the edge we got. And the fever broke for what? 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours max. And then it came raging back. And the country, or a big chunk of this country, is still afflicted by that fever. And so let's look at what this anti-democracy movement consists of. It's not just an authoritarian movement. We should be careful on language. You could have an authoritarian movement that consists of maybe a handful of generals, or just a small cabal of people, but there are tens of millions of people who are buying into this anti-democracy movement. I think it's a fascist movement. Fascist movements have mass bases. This has a mass base. A fascist movement traffics in racism. This movement traffics in racism and anti-Semitism. The guy who did the heinous mass murder in Buffalo, who wrote a manifesto about it, loaded with racist language. He singled out 10 African-American shoppers. He drove several hours to go to an African-American supermarket. And if you read his manifesto, he said, actually, it's Jews who are behind the whole thing. We'll kill some black people first, and then we'll go after the Jews. So the anti-Semitism and the racism are really just below the surface of this movement. And what constitutes this anti-democracy movement? Well, there's the Trump cult, of course. They're the people who think this Donald Trump is the greatest thing since the SOS ban. And then there is white nationalists. And there's an overlap, a big overlap between the Trump cult followers and the white nationalists. And Trump gave a permission slip to every racist and bigot and homophobe and anti-Semite and sexist in the country to come out from behind their rocks and be just as ugly in public and violent in public as they ever wanted to be. And so we're dealing with that issue. And then there's another issue, and it's just irrationalism itself. It's hard for our democracy to function with this level of irrationalism in the country. Irrationalism around the election in November 2020, and we hear all this irrationalism here in Wisconsin about that. Gableman and the huge circus that he's been running, endlessly running, with permission and a checkbook from Robin Voss. We hear it from Janelle Brandtjen, who heads of all things the Wisconsin Elections Committee at the Assembly, and Voss appointed Gableman, and Voss appointed Brandtjen. There's Timothy Rampton, who's running for governor, who wants us to decertify our electoral college votes from the last time around. Every single person running for governor on the Republican side wants to get rid of the Wisconsin Elections Commission on these bogus claims that something untoward happened during the elections. And it's been studied 6 ways to Sunday, and those elections weren't stolen, they weren't fraudulent, the elections were overwhelmingly fair. Joe Biden won, Donald Trump lost, and these Trump people are the biggest sore losers in the history of competition, whether it's athletic competition or whether it's political competition. They're like the enraged parents who didn't like the referee's call, and they're arguing in the parking lot a year and a half after the game ended. It's ridiculous, it's absurd, but that's going on. So there's the irrationalism over the election. There's irrationalism over COVID, right? Million dead isn't enough people for some to realize that we have a real virus out there that's killing. QAnon, really crazy irrational stuff in QAnon. So we have the Trump cult, we have white nationalism, we have irrationalism, we have a Republican Party, this is the fourth element, a Republican Party that is thrown in with the fascists. How else can you interpret the line from the head of the Republican National Committee that what happened on January 6th was legitimate political protest? Those are 3 of the most obscene words I've ever heard in politics. There's nothing legitimate about spearing police officers with an American flag. There's nothing legitimate about trashing the Capitol. There's nothing legitimate about trashing Nancy Pelosi's office and screaming, hang Mike Pence, and erecting gallows to hang him with. So this was not legitimate political protest. We've seen a rewriting of our history right before our eyes, and we can't fall for it. And then the last element of this anti-democracy movement is the right-wing media. There is a media ecosystem on the right that feeds every element of this white nationalist movement, and it feeds tens of millions of people on a daily basis, 24/7, as though it's an IV drip that they're just getting constantly, sitting in their chair getting this IV drip of toxic propaganda, and if that's all they consume, that's all they believe. It's garbage in, it's garbage out, and it's a heap of garbage. And that's a real problem for our democracy. So how do we combat this anti-democracy movement? How do we defeat the anti-democracy movement? I think it is the most, or certainly one of the three most pivotal questions. One is how to avoid nuclear war in this Ukraine crisis. Another is how to solve the global climate crisis. But how do we save our democracy? First, I think we've got to indict Donald Trump, and you and I aren't going to indict him. Merrick Garland's got to get off his ass and indict Donald Trump. There's plenty of evidence out there already, a mountain of evidence out there. I don't know what Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, is waiting for. How much more evidence do you need of election tampering than Donald Trump on tape telling the Secretary of State of Georgia, Raffensperger, just go find me 11,780 votes. That's election tampering, plain and simple. And then you have the John Eastman memo to Trump, telling Trump all the ways that he can overturn the election, including making use of false electors. And we had our false electors here in Wisconsin, including Bob Spindell, who unbelievably still sits on the Wisconsin Elections Commission and now wants to be chair of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. So we got to indict Donald Trump. There must be accountability at the highest level. I know some people make the argument, well, you can't have a precedent where the last guy in the White House is prosecuted by the next guy in the White House. But it's not like he ran a red light. That's not the crime he's being indicted for or should be indicted for. He committed one of the worst possible crimes you can commit. He wanted to overthrow our democracy. And he told us he was going to do it. He said he wouldn't pledge to give a peaceful transition of power. He said in a speech in December he wanted to overturn the election. He kept telling us all this stuff straight up. It's not like they need to hire 1,000 investigators at the Justice Department to find his motives. His motives were out in the open. And so he must be held accountable for it. He's got to be indicted. The second thing we need to do is uplift the voices of some sane Republicans out there who are telling the truth about what happened in the election. Now, I never thought I'd say a decent word about a Cheney in my adult lifetime, because I hate Dick Cheney with a real passion. And Dick Cheney, along with George W. Bush, belong at the International Criminal Court, along with Vladimir Putin, for starting a war of choice. The Iraq War was a war of choice. It was an illegal war under international law. In fact, it was the worst crime you can commit under international law, at least according to the Nuremberg trials, which is to commit a war of choice, an unnecessary war, an unprovoked war. And of course, Cheney was supervising the illegal torture campaign that the United States engaged in as well. But Liz Cheney, I love me some Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney has been a real profile in courage. She got an award from the John F. Kennedy School for being a profile in courage, and she deserves that award. She's risked her political career. She's probably gotten death threats, lots of death threats, for speaking out about her own party and the leader of her own party. And so I have great admiration for Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. And here in Wisconsin, actually, I've got great admiration for Senator Kathy Bernier, who heads the Senate election committee. She's retiring. She's from Chippewa Falls, but she has spoken out quite bluntly, calling the Gableman investigation a charade, saying Trump lost fair and square, telling her party to move on. And so she should be applauded for that. Dean Knutson, the Republican on the Wisconsin Elections Commission, who just announced that he's retiring, he said the same thing. There wasn't fraud at any widespread level that would have changed the outcome of the November election. And he told the Republican Party to move on. The Republican Party won't move on. It's caught in the throes of this Donald Trump big lie fantasy land. But we need to uphold those voices Even Paul Ryan, former Speaker of the House of Representatives from Janesville, has been saying recently and said previously that Trump lost, Biden won, no fraud, move on. I mean, those are the messages that have got to get through to people. And there's a fraction of the people out there that I think we need to work on. This is something that we can do individually in our lives. I think each of us probably knows a couple people in our wider social circle who didn't vote the way we wanted them to vote, who were tempted by, the Trump, whatever, the Trump lies, the propaganda that they've been ingesting on Fox News, and are otherwise, you know them as pretty decent people or normal people, or these are people you exercise with or worship with or play cards with or in book club with. I think if we could just identify each of us 2 people in our lives that we can try to work on and try to bring back from the abyss of anti-democracy, we'd be doing the whole country a world of good. I think we're going to save our democracy that way, person to person, as much as by any other way, and even as much as by voting. Of course, we got to go out and vote. We got to get everybody we know to go out and vote. It's really crucial, but we can't just say every other person in Wisconsin is a nut because they voted for Trump and we are going to write them out of the book of life. I don't think that is a healthy attitude to have in a democracy or in any civil society. I also think it's bad politics because not all those people are flying Confederate flags or whatever that Brandon sign flag is that a neighbor of mine is flying. Not all of them have, swastika tattoos on their biceps. I mean, the vast majority of these supporters, they can be talked to. Some of them can be talked to. I'm not going to talk to my neighbor who's flying the Brandon flag. I don't think that would be a useful use of my time, even though the person's a bird watcher like me, which frustrates me no end. But I do know some people I play cards with, who I've in ongoing conversation with. And these hearings coming up on January 6th gives you an occasion to say, did you see the hearing or did you hear the news? What these guys, they were chanting hang Mike Pence and Trump was saying, yeah, that's a good idea. Is that really something you're in favor of? I mean, I have a nephew who's kind of a QAnon person, and the mother of his child is a QA mom. She's really out there, but I called him or Facebooked him on the evening of January 6th, and I contacted one of my friends I play cards with who I knew was tempted by Trump, and I said, you can't be for what's going on January 6th, and he wasn't, and he still isn't. And so, there are ways to try to bring people back to reality and back to a safer position in our democracy. So we got to do that. And I think, if we all do our little parts, I think we'll ultimately defeat them. We need a united front from Liz Cheney to Bernie Sanders, from Kathy Bernier to Francesca Hong, who's the most progressive person in the Wisconsin Assembly. Just a united front in defense of democracy. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, one of my heroes, used to say, if we all do our little bits of good where we are, those little bits of good put together will change the world. And I really believe that. I think if we do those little bits of good, we'll be able to beat this anti-democracy movement. But we got a big task on our hands. Here I just want to read for 3 minutes, then I'll take some questions. So this is the conclusion to this little book. And the conclusion is called Why I'm Hopeful. Now, I've been an editor for 43 years, so I edit my own stuff. You can see I crossed out most of this for this reading. So I turned the 10 Commandments into 5 if you give me a pen in 5 minutes. But anyway, why I'm hopeful. I recognize that democracy has been taking a beating lately here in Wisconsin and across the country, but I don't lose heart and I don't give up, and here's why. First, I travel all over the state of Wisconsin and I see the amazing work that grassroots activists are doing every day. And I'm hopeful because over the past 7 years, I've seen the progressive nonprofit sector in Wisconsin unify itself and work harmoniously toward our shared goals. We've torn down our silos, we've shelled our egos, at least for the most part, and we got a lot of young and impressive leaders without this gray hair, taking on more and more responsibility, and they will lead us forward. I also take hope from the movement for Black lives. You know, in Wisconsin, after the George Floyd murder, there were more than 50 protests in 50 communities across Wisconsin, almost all of them entirely peaceful, and some of them in communities that had never seen a civil rights protest, even at the height of the 1960s civil rights movement. There you go. And so that was a very inspiring thing to see, and I'm glad it happened right here in Mount Oro. I also take hope from the mass movement to combat the climate crisis and for the mass movement to defend a woman's freedom to choose. I was at that pro-choice rally a couple of weeks ago at the Capitol, and it's great to see, again, all the activism of young people in driving these movements. But frankly, part of being hopeful is a state of mind. And here's the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney with a little verse that Biden himself likes as a good Irishman. Once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice rises up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge, and believe that the further shore is reachable from here. And I do believe that further shore is reachable from here. I also kind of like this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. History isn't solely in our hands, and still you're called to struggle, not because it assures you of victory, but because it assures you of an honorable and sane life. I just love that, honorable and sane life. You might not get rich, you may not win, but you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I've been leading an honorable and sane life. None of us is assured of victory, of course, but I know one thing for certain: great democracy reforms won't happen without citizen activism or without mass movements. That's the lesson I learned from Ralph Nader, who I worked for after I graduated college, and that's the lesson I learned from the people's historian Howard Zinn, who wrote for me at the Progressive in the last dozen years of his life. On my wall at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, and sometimes on our fridge at home, is this quote from Howard Zinn, so I just want to read a bit of it. To be hopeful in bad times isn't just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. If we remember those times and places, he said, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. He concluded, if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future, because to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that's bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. So certainly let us defy all that's bad around us, and for sure, let's celebrate all that's good around us, and let's save democracy here in Wisconsin and around the country. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So I'm happy to take a question or two, or three. Sure.
You want me to use the mic?
No, yeah, go ahead.
Well, back in 2010, when Scott Walker was campaigning for governor, the words "I hate unions" never escaped his lips. But as soon as he gained power, we found out what he thought about unions. He did everything in his power to destroy them. About the only bright glimmer I've seen about the union movement in Wisconsin in the last decade is Tom Nelson's book, One Day Stronger, about how a union managed to save a paper mill in Allegheny County, where Tom is the county executive. Do you have anything to say in your book about unions and their ability to stand up for working people, and what role they have to play in saving our democracy?
Sure, I sure do. In the chapter on economic equality, I started by talking about Act 10 and talk about Walker's assault on first public sector workers and then private sector workers. And I talk about the need to support unionization. So that's a huge part of that chapter. So yeah, in fact, the book kind of, a different way of looking at the book is, here's what happened under the Walker era, and here's how we recover from the Walker era. So there's a lot of that in there.
Hi, I'm from rural Iowa originally, And a lot of my associates on Facebook, I don't think that they necessarily understand that their positions, I'm talking about the ones from rural Iowa, I don't think they understand that their positions are autocratic. And so I'm just wondering, how do you necessarily connect to them to let them understand that when they support Trump's positions, that they are supporting autocracy?
Really good question. I think we need to have candidates who talk to them where they are about their economic circumstances. And Bernie Sanders was popular in rural Iowa. Jesse Jackson was popular in rural Iowa. Both were popular in rural Wisconsin. And there are a lot of folks working this problem here in Wisconsin too. Wisconsin Farmers Unions for one. There's a rural coalition that a woman named Julie Emery is running that's trying to get word out to folks there. Jim Hightower and Mike McCabe always talked about, it's not right versus left, it's top versus bottom. And people at the bottom, no matter their color or their zip code, they have a lot in common, whether they're in the city or whether they're in the country. And so we need to talk about those things with folks wherever they are. I heard Mandela Barnes talk about agribusiness the other day and big factory farms, and that's a way to speak a language that I think people can understand too. George.
I don't need a microphone, I got a big mouth.
All right, go ahead.
I just was wondering, how come Zinn's statements is only sometimes on the refrigerator?
Oh, because sometimes there's...
Tired of that, perhaps?
No, it's just, sometimes there's too much up there. But I don't know why it fell down or came off the last time it did, but it's not up there now. But it's been up there periodically. It'll probably be up there again.
I've been reading a lot about the dissolution of the fairness doctrine in the 80s, and I'm wondering how you think that might be reapplied in an era of multi-platform.
Yeah, the fairness doctrine was destroyed by Reagan and gave birth to cable news in right-wing, in talk radio, which is overwhelmingly right-wing. In Wisconsin, it's like 95% of talk radio is conservative talk radio. And the fairness doctrine said if you're using the public airwaves, you got to give equal time to folks on both sides of an issue or all sides of an issue. I think it was very important. It kept the discourse in this country much more civil than it is today. I don't know how realistically we're going to get it back anytime soon. Of course, some of the reforms in there aren't going to happen anytime soon either. So that's not a disqualification, but I think it's going to be hard. And it's harder with the internet because the argument that a lot of folks make, well, it's no longer whether you have the money to own a printing press. Everyone's got a printing press on their phone. But that's false. I mean, we all don't have as much power as the Murdochs or the 5 corporations that own most of the big media. So I do think that the destruction of the fairness doctrine is part of the thing that led to where we are today, for sure. Last question.
It's gonna be a good one, right?
Pressure's on.
Just a comment and then a question. It goes to your point about economic inequality, and I'm convinced that Walker was most successful with politics of resentment and was able to set neighbor against neighbor throughout the rural areas of the state.
Totally true.
And, Trump just mined it that much more effectively. The other day I saw a back window pickup truck in my parking lot, which is accounting offices and a medical clinic, and it said, "Fuck Joe Biden, Trump is my president."
Right.
And so I'm not gonna get very far trying to change that kind of stuff.
No, you don't want to knock on his windshield.
I'll take those little fake bullet hole decals and put them on the back. Pickup truck window. But anyway, the question becomes, how do you communicate to get around this mindset based on fear or resentment, and particularly when you're perceived as someone who was on the lucky side,
Well, I mean, you're right about the politics of resentment, and Kathy Kramer wrote a great book about that, and others have followed in her footsteps. But you can really feel that when you go out to rural Wisconsin. I think more people from Madison and Milwaukee need to go speak in rural communities. People are delighted when you just show up there and talk. And there are good progressive activists fighting in every community in this state. And just to say, oh, it's way out there, or it's redneck, or it's super conservative is a very unhealthy approach to take. And I know George is going to go north and try to get more people, communities to pass resolutions and referendums about overturning Citizens United. So that's a good effort. You know, I still think we need to talk. I'm thinking of a person in my card game community, my card community, who is a divorced father of an 18-year-old. It was an ugly divorce. He's been selling either life insurance or Medicare supplement insurance with bad bosses, kind of a, you know, struggling, works hard, makes a decent living now, but it's not having fun doing it, you know. And was a huge Trump supporter. And I don't know ultimately if I'm going to bring this guy around to seeing the world more the way I do, but I think the way to start is just by nurturing those relationships and not nurturing them in a yelling at them, calling them names, saying, you're a fool, you're an idiot, why do you believe this crazy stuff? But just connecting on some human level. How's your kid? Congratulations, your kid graduated, you know, whatever it is, and you know, how are you doing the new job, or whatever it is. And then just over time, you know, try to bring people around. We have witnessed one of the great nonviolent revolutions in our lifetimes over the last 50 years, and by that I mean the great nonviolent revolution for gay rights, LGBT rights. And that wasn't done except by talking to people close to us who never knew anyone who was gay or didn't like people they thought who were gay. But I mean, to some extent, it's similar. A lot of people demonize liberals or progressives. You know, they think we got horns or something. And if you can just talk to a couple people and tell them to palpate your skull and see that you don't have horns, that's a plus. And just by that, I mean just to know that you're a decent human being and that you see the world a little differently, and you know, gosh, maybe you should take a look through your lens once in a while. And I think we can bring some fraction of the folks who are tempted by some of this dangerous, toxic craziness to give it up, to give it back, and to come back around. And to me, that's our biggest hope.